Dr. Elias Kincaid was not your average physician. By all means, he should have been just another overworked doctor scribbling notes into a computer, pushing pills, and delivering grim diagnoses. Instead, he had built a reputation as a healer of the unusual, the mysterious, and the inexplicable. His methods were unorthodox, but undeniably effective. In the world of traditional medicine, Elias was a throwback, a relic. He didn't rely on fancy machines or even the newest drugs. No, he used an ancient tool, one passed down from his grandfather, a man who had been an eccentric healer in his own right, employing the unconventional methods of mystics and spiritualists. But Elias wasn't some wide-eyed mystic. He was a doctor with a purpose, and his purpose was to understand. He had spent years working in prestigious hospitals and learning every aspect of modern science, but it was the oddities, the unexplained cases, that had always drawn him in. It was an early spring morning when Elias first encountered the orb. He had heard of it before. His grandfather had often spoken of the orb with reverence, calling it a conduit, a device that could peer into the soul and reveal the unseen. To Elias, it had always sounded like fantastical nonsense, but when his grandfather died and left him everything, he inherited the orb along with the journal full of ramblings that no one had ever truly understood. The orb itself was deceptively simple, a translucent glass sphere, about the size of a grapefruit, with a faint purple glow that seemed to pulse when touched. It was like nothing he'd ever seen in a medical textbook or even in the paranormal cases he'd read about in his youth. Curious but skeptical, Elias placed it on the counter in his study and went on with his life, until that fateful afternoon. His first real encounter with the orb happened by accident. He had been working late, poring over the medical charts of a new patient, a woman in her late 40s, suffering from unexplained pains that seemed to shift from one area of her body to another, as if her illness had no true origin. It was a condition that no specialist could diagnose, and modern science had no answers. The woman's life had spiraled into a dark maze of mystery and pain. She had been to several doctors, all of whom shrugged their shoulders and prescribed stronger medications. Elias had sat there in his dimly lit office, his eyes aching from hours of staring at a screen, when something compelled him to glance at the orb. It was as if the glass were calling to him. He reached for it with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, placing his palm against the cool surface. The moment his skin touched the orb, he felt it, a surge, a tingle, like static electricity, but deeper, more profound. The orb seemed to hum softly, almost imperceptibly, and then, he saw it wasn't a vision in the traditional sense. Elias felt his awareness expand, felt his perception shift beyond the normal realm. His surroundings blurred as his consciousness zoomed into the woman's body, into the fibers of her being. He could feel her pain, not as a simple sensation, but as an energy, a force. And then he saw it, a dark, swirling mass of energy lodged deep within her chest, radiating outward like the roots of a twisted tree. The pain was not biological. It was something else entirely. Elias recoiled in shock, ripping his hand away from the orb. The vision shattered, and the hum of the orb faded into silence. For a moment, he sat there, dazed, unsure of what had just happened. Was it his imagination? Some trick of the mind? He could still feel the weight of that dark energy in his chest, as though it had marked him in some way. He glanced down at the orb, now sitting innocuously on the desk as if it had never done anything at all. Impossible, he muttered to himself. But there was no denying it. His heart raced with excitement and fear, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. What had he seen? What was it? Later that day, he called the woman back into his office. He couldn't explain what had happened, he didn't understand it himself, but something told him that it wasn't just a hallucination. Tell me, when did the pain start? He asked, voice steady despite the storm of thoughts brewing in his head. The woman, her face a mix of exhaustion and hope, seemed to be trying to recall something. It started about 6 months ago, after my father passed away, she said softly, eyes flicking to the floor. It was a few weeks before his funeral, I think. That's when the pain began, first in my chest, then in my arms, and now it moves around. Sometimes it's in my stomach, sometimes my head, but never in one place for long." Elias leaned forward, his instincts firing. "What were you feeling when it started? What was your emotional state?" The woman's gaze turned inward, and for a moment, she didn't speak. I was devastated. My father was everything to me. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think, I couldn't let go of him. It was like I was drowning in grief." Elias nodded slowly. He could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. It wasn't just grief, it was desperation, attachment, fear, all the emotional energy she had bottled up inside her, unable to release. And somehow, that energy had manifested physically, tormenting her with a phantom illness that no doctor could explain. "You're not sick," he said quietly, almost to himself. "At least, not in the way you think." The woman's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Elias met her gaze, feeling the weight of his newfound realization. "The pain you're experiencing is not a biological illness. It's emotional. The grief you've held onto, your father's death, it's manifesting in your body. Your pain is your mind's way of coping with the trauma. You need to release it. You need to grieve, truly grieve, and let go. Only then will you heal." The woman blinked, confused. "But how?" "I've tried. I've been to therapy, I've taken medications, I've prayed, but nothing works." "That's because it's not a medical issue," Elias said. "You can't medicate grief. You can't fix it with pills. But you can transform it." With a practiced hand, Elias reached for the orb again. This time, as he held it, he spoke softly to the woman. "I need you to trust me. I can help you, but you have to do something first. I need you to close your eyes and let go of everything you're holding on to." The woman hesitated, but then, something shifted in her. The room seemed to grow warmer, the air heavier with anticipation. She closed her eyes, and as she did, Elias focused on the orb in his hand. He felt the pulse of her grief, the weight of it pressing against his consciousness. For the first time, he understood the profound truth that his grandfather had known, that illness was not just a physical ailment, it was a manifestation of the mind's deepest wounds. As he concentrated, the orb glowed brighter, the humming deepening in resonance. He felt it, the release. The woman's grief, once locked within her, began to flow outward, like dark tendrils being pulled from her body. Slowly, they unraveled, dissipating into the space around them. When the light finally faded, Elias opened his eyes. The woman sat still, her face pale but serene. She opened her eyes, blinking in disbelief. "My chest, the pain is gone," she whispered. How did you do that?" Elias exhaled slowly. "I didn't do anything. You did it. You just had to let go." That was the moment Elias Kincaid's life changed forever. He had always believed in the power of science, but now he had glimpsed something far deeper, something that defied explanation, and yet, felt so undeniably real. He didn't fully understand it yet, but he knew that he had uncovered something far greater than the ability to diagnose disease. He had uncovered a new frontier of healing, one that was not bound by the body, but by the mind. And now, the questions began to pile up. What other afflictions could be connected to the mind? Could there be more to this phenomenon than just emotional pain? Could psychic energy be the root cause of not just illness, but all of human suffering? As the woman left his office, now free of her pain, Elias sat in his chair, gazing at the orb. It pulsed softly, almost knowingly, as if waiting for him to take the next step, and so he would. But this was only the beginning. Elias didn't sleep much that night. He kept the orb on his desk, its faint purple glow casting long shadows across the room. It was as though the light had some magnetic pull, drawing his attention to it, even as his thoughts tried to drift elsewhere. What had happened with the woman? What had he really seen in her body, felt in her pain? It didn't make sense. No, it made perfect sense, and yet it couldn't possibly be true. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that strange energy in his chest, the same way he'd felt when he'd touched the orb, as if there was some invisible connection between his own mind and the forces around him. For a moment, it felt as though the boundaries between what was inside him and what was outside were blurring, blending into something larger, something uncharted. He couldn't just ignore it, so he didn't. Elias found himself returning to the orb the next day, morning light streaming through his office window. He needed to understand what it could do, what it was trying to show him. He needed answers. If the orb had that kind of power, that kind of insight into the human body and psyche, how far could it go? How much could it reveal about the true nature of disease, about the very essence of human suffering? He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and placed his palm against the orb again. The soft hum filled the room, and once more, his perception shifted. At first, there was nothing. Then the vision came, dark, turbulent shapes swirling around him, a vision of sickness and pain unlike anything he had ever seen, but this time, it wasn't just one person. It was a collection of people, their energy swirling like a storm, building on itself. There was a man sitting in a hospital bed, his skin pale, his breath shallow. But as Elias focused, he saw the man's ailment wasn't just cancer, as his doctors had diagnosed, it was guilt. The man had lived with a deep shame for years, a betrayal he couldn't forgive himself for. The cancer was the physical manifestation of that guilt, a way for his body to reflect the emotional chaos he had never dealt with. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the magnitude of what he was seeing. The orb wasn't just detecting physical diseases, it was showing him something far more profound, the psychic energy beneath it all. The guilt, the fear, the grief, it wasn't just metaphysical, it was real, just as real as a tumor, just as capable of harming the body. And now Elias could see it, could sense it with every fiber of his being. When the vision faded, Elias opened his eyes, breathless, his mind racing. He felt a deeper understanding, a connection that transcended the limits of conventional medicine. This wasn't just about curing diseases, it was about understanding the mind-body connection, the relationship between consciousness and physical health. The door to his office creaked open, and Elias's thoughts snapped back to the present. His nurse, Claire, stood in the doorway, her face a mask of polite concern. "Dr. Kincaid," she asked gently. "You've got another patient coming in soon." Elias nodded absently, not fully registering her words. He glanced back at the orb. It was still glowing faintly on the desk, almost as if waiting for him to take the next step. "The next step in unraveling this mystery. I'll be right out," he said, his voice distant. Claire didn't say anything else, sensing that Elias was lost in thought. She closed the door quietly behind her. Elias took a moment, shaking himself out of his stupor, and then he turned to his patient records. The name on the schedule caught his eye, Tommy Davis, a 32-year-old man with a long history of chronic back pain that no amount of treatment seemed to alleviate. In fact, Tommy had seen so many doctors that he had become a running joke among the local medical community, an endless string of tests and scans with no conclusive result. Elias had seen Tommy before, and his case had stumped him. The man's back pain was real, of that much Elias was certain. But he knew, deep down, that it wasn't just physical. There was something else going on, a hidden cause, an unspoken truth. As Elias sat down at his desk, the orb still faintly glowing in his peripheral vision, he had a nagging sense of déjà vu. Could this case be the key? Could Tommy's suffering reveal more about what Elias was beginning to understand? Tommy shuffled into the room a few moments later, his face drawn and tired. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, the strain of his never-ending pain visible in the slump of his shoulders. Elias gestured for him to sit, taking a deep breath as he prepared to listen. "Tell me, Tommy, what's going on today?" Elias asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Tommy winced as he sat down, his hands instinctively going to his lower back. "Doc, you know the drill," he muttered. "Pain's been the same. Sometimes it's sharp, sometimes it's dull, but it's always there." Elias nodded, leaning forward. "I know. But you're here for a reason, aren't you?" What's changed? Tommy's eyes flicked to the floor, then back up at Elias. There was a hesitation in his gaze, a quiet wariness that seemed to hang in the air. I don't know if this matters, Tommy started, his voice low. But my brother's been in town. He just moved back after a long time, and we've been trying to work things out. Elias's brow furrowed. Trying to work things out? Tommy ran a hand through his hair, looking frustrated. Yeah, we haven't spoken in years. A lot of bad blood between us. And I guess it's been getting to me more than I thought. I didn't even realize it, but I feel like something's been tightening up inside me, like a knot, and it's just, it's making everything worse. Elias's mind whirled. There it was again, the emotional connection, the unacknowledged trauma seeping into the body. Tell me more about your brother. What happened between you two? Tommy's face hardened, his jaw clenched. It's a long story. But it's mostly my fault. I messed things up when we were younger. He trusted me with something important, and I failed him. And now, we're trying to patch things up. But it's hard. Every time we talk, it's like all that anger comes flooding back. Elias sat back in his chair, his thoughts moving quickly. This was it, the back pain wasn't just physical. It was the manifestation of the unresolved anger, the guilt, the brotherly bond that had been broken and never mended. Tommy's body was holding on to that rage, that emotional burden, and it was manifesting in his back, a constant, nagging reminder of his guilt and regret. You're not sick, Tommy, Elias said, his voice steady. Your pain is real, but it's not coming from your back. It's coming from something inside you. Your body is holding on to your anger, your guilt. The pain you're feeling is the result of all that unresolved emotion. Tommy looked at him as though Elias had just spoken a foreign language. What are you talking about? Elias leaned forward, his eyes piercing into Tommy's. I know this might sound strange, but your back pain isn't just physical. It's connected to your relationship with your brother. You've been carrying this weight for years, and now it's manifesting in your body. Tommy opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His gaze flickered toward the door, then back to Elias, as though trying to decide whether to laugh or run out of the room. I know this doesn't make sense, Elias said gently. But I've seen it before. It's not just the body that gets sick. Sometimes the mind, the emotions, the spirit, they get sick, too. And they don't always show up in ways we expect. Tommy shook his head slowly, as if trying to process what Elias had said. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. So, what do I do about it? How do I fix this? Elias gave him a small, knowing smile. The first step is acknowledging it. You need to face your anger, your guilt, and let go of it. You need to heal the emotional wounds you've been carrying for so long. Once you do that, the physical pain will begin to fade. Tommy sat there for a moment, the weight of Elias's words sinking in. Then, with a deep sigh, he nodded. I'll try. I don't know if it'll work, but I'll try. Elias nodded, standing up as he gestured to the door. I know you will. Take your time with it, Tommy. And remember, healing isn't always immediate. It takes time. But I believe you can do it. As Tommy left, Elias stood in the middle of his office, the orb glowing softly on his desk. The pieces were coming together, slowly but surely. The orb was showing him something profound. Illness wasn't just a physical affliction. It was the manifestation of unresolved emotional and psychic energy, an energy that could be healed, transformed, and released, but that wasn't all. Elias knew, deep down, that there was more to discover, more to understand. This journey was only beginning. And the questions, the mysteries, would only grow. Elias knew he was on the cusp of uncovering something that could change everything, and he couldn't wait to see where it would lead him next. Elias sat still for a moment, the soft hum of the orb still reverberating in his mind, but his thoughts quickly turned inward. It was only when Tommy left his office that Elias realized how much this was affecting him, not just professionally, but personally. There was an uneasiness that had settled deep inside him, a question that he couldn't shake. What if the orb was doing more than just revealing illnesses? What if it was altering the way he saw the world, the way he understood his patients, and even himself? He shook off the thought and stood up, pacing the room, trying to clear his mind. But as he moved, the room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing together in a subtle but undeniable way. It wasn't just his office. Elias was starting to feel the weight of every emotional wound, every suppressed fear, every guilt-ridden regret that he had never fully confronted in his own life. The orb wasn't just a tool for healing, it was opening doors inside him, doors he had kept locked for years that he needed to understand why. He looked at the orb again, its faint glow pulsing with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Elias hesitated for a moment, then reached for it, feeling that familiar tingle travel up his arm as he made contact. This time, however, he had a different approach. He wasn't simply going to use it to diagnose another patient. He was going to peer deeper, into himself. Closing his eyes, Elias let the orb's energy wash over him. The hum grew louder, reverberating through his body as his thoughts blurred into a whirl of colors, shadows, and fleeting sensations. The world around him dissolved, leaving only his mind. And then, he saw it. He saw the moments in his life that had shaped him. The first time his mother had looked at him with disappointment in her eyes, the endless hours spent in hospitals where his father's deteriorating health consumed their family. He felt the isolation, the ache of those long, lonely years in medical school when he had pushed everyone away to focus on his studies. He saw how his desire to fix everything had often led him to shut off the very emotions that could have connected him to others. The guilt of his mother's unspoken sorrow, his father's silent rage, and his own inability to ever truly confront those wounds, that was the root of his own detachment, his own inability to connect with the emotional world. And there it was, buried deep inside him, fear. Fear of failure, fear of being vulnerable, fear of facing the things that had always been too painful to acknowledge. And now, the orb was showing him that this fear was not just something that lived inside his mind, it had taken root in his body. The tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his chest, the unease in his stomach, it was all connected. Elias had spent his whole life denying his own emotional needs, focusing only on the logic of medicine, on finding the answers, and now, it was clear, those answers had always been inside him. He opened his eyes, blinking rapidly, disoriented by the clarity of it all. The orb lay still on the desk, but he could still feel its presence in his mind, as though it was waiting for him to make a choice. Do I continue down this path? He thought to himself. Do I follow the logic, the science, or do I embrace this new understanding, this new way of seeing the world? The answer came quickly and decisively. He had always believed in the mind-body connection. But now, he saw that connection differently. It wasn't just about physical ailments, it was about energy, emotions, and unresolved psychic trauma, and how they manifested in the body. He realized he had been treating symptoms without truly understanding the root causes of his patient's suffering. Elias stood up, feeling more certain of his purpose than he had in years. His approach was changing, not just as a doctor, but as a person. He had always thought of healing as something external, something separate from his own experiences. But now he knew the truth. Healing wasn't just about curing disease, it was about healing the whole person, mind, body, and soul. The next few days were a blur. Elias treated his patients with a newfound sense of purpose, but his approach was different. He no longer relied solely on medical tests and procedures. Instead, he guided his patients through deep introspection, helping them confront their emotions, their fears, their unresolved traumas. And the results were nothing short of miraculous. A woman who had struggled with chronic migraines for years found relief after facing the grief of losing her childhood home in a fire. A man who had been suffering from severe insomnia for months slept soundly after finally acknowledging the guilt he had carried over his mother's death. The energy in the office shifted, and Elias could feel it with every patient. The orb wasn't just a tool, it was a gateway, and the more he used it, the more he uncovered about the complex web that connected the mind and the body. But with each new discovery, Elias also felt something darker looming in the background. There were times when the orb showed him something more than just emotional pain. There were glimpses of strange, almost otherworldly energies, deep, unsettling forces that seemed to twist and distort reality itself. These were not the healing energies of his patients, these were energies that fed off pain, off fear, off unresolved conflict. He couldn't ignore them. One afternoon, after a particularly draining session, Elias found himself staring at the orb, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had seen. The energy that some people carried, it wasn't just an effect of their own suffering. There were forces in the world that seemed to manipulate that suffering, feeding off it, twisting it into something darker. And if he was to truly understand the full scope of the orb's power, he would have to confront this force, this presence, head-on. He wasn't alone in this pursuit. Not by a long shot. Later that evening, Elias was approached by a former colleague, a psychiatrist named Dr. William Hollister. William had always been a skeptic, a man who prided himself on his logical, scientific approach to mental health. But recently, Elias had noticed something strange. William had been looking increasingly unsettled, his once neat appearance slipping into a disheveled, almost desperate state. "Elias," William said, his voice tight, "I need to talk to you. Something's happening. Something I don't understand." Elias nodded, gesturing for him to sit. He had already suspected that William's curiosity about his unorthodox methods had turned into something more. "I've been seeing something in my patients," William continued, rubbing his temples. "It's not just the usual depression or anxiety. It's darker. More insidious. These patients, they're suffering, but it's like they're being driven to their pain, pushed toward it, even when they try to heal. It's like something is feeding off their suffering." Elias's heart skipped a beat. He had felt it, too. He had seen it in the orb, that shadow, that dark presence that clung to the energy of pain and grief. "I think it's not just our minds that are connected," Elias said softly, looking directly at William. "There's something more. Something that feeds off our suffering, that manipulates it." William stared at him, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you saying?" Elias took a deep breath. "I think we're dealing with something far beyond what we understand. It's not just our minds that influence our bodies, it's our emotions, our energies, and sometimes, these energies aren't just ours. They can be twisted, turned into something darker. Something that exists on a different plane, something that thrives on the pain of others." For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of Elias's words hanging in the air. William's face slowly drained of color as the implications of what Elias had just said sank in. "This isn't just about healing anymore, is it?" William whispered. Elias shook his head. "No. It's about something bigger. Something dangerous." As Elias continued his work, he knew that the answers were just out of reach. The orb had revealed more than he had ever imagined, but it had also opened a door to something far darker, a presence that existed in the shadows, lurking just beyond the veil of human perception. Elias didn't know where this journey would lead him, but one thing was certain: he was no longer just a doctor trying to cure diseases. He was now on the precipice of uncovering the true nature of consciousness, and the forces that shaped it. And as he stared at the orb once more, its light growing dimmer as the room darkened, Elias knew that the next step was inevitable. The truth was calling, and he had no choice but to follow.